We are victorious, whether in life or in death. And it makes a difference how you face struggles when you know going in that you've already won. Few things are as emboldening to somebody in a competition as knowing you've already won. Victory belongs to Jesus. Again, it is a joy to worship with you. On this day and in this time of challenge, I want to suggest to you that this is the time where we recall and count on everything that we have learned. As believers, the worst thing we can do in a time of crisis is to reduce our faith to contemporary knowledge. That it's a time for you to count on what you've grown up knowing in God and put all that together. As a matter of fact, the lesson for today is really one born out of Israel's growth on how they saw God, how they changed. And it is also based upon how my own theology about God has evolved and how both the lessons of my childhood and of my formal training has helped me to see the kind of God that we actually have. We have been told to shelter in place. Look with me, won't you, in Psalm 91. In Psalm 91, in 2 verses, there are 4 names given for our God. Psalm 91, verses 1 and 2. It says, "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in Him I will trust. The grass withers, the flowers thereof fadeth away, but the word of our God shall stand forever." I want to talk today. We've been instructed by our civil authorities, and again, I encourage you to obey civil authorities. We've been instructed to shelter in place. But if we're going to shelter in place, I think it's important that we understand that as believers, we have a place to shelter in. Now, I'm married to an English teacher, and I know I'm going to get in trouble because the proper title of this sermon should be "A Place Wherein to Shelter." But I pray in this time of challenge, she's going to grant me orator's liberty and let me talk about a place to shelter in. I like Psalm 91 because Psalm 91 is really the story of how Israel evolved in their theology of God. Israel started out as a group of people who were monolatrous, or they believed in monolatry. Monolatry is the idea that other gods exist, but I'm only going to worship one God. They evolved into a group who became monotheistic, who believes that there's only one God. Israel thought that since our God did so much, that there had to be more than one. There was a God who was over the rain, a God who was over the sun. Israel thought about God somewhat akin to that grandmother who was talking to a granddaughter, and the granddaughter had visited her from college and brought in some of her friends, and the grandmother kept saying, "Baby, the Lord are good. The Lord sure are good." Finally, the little college-educated granddaughter had enough. She said, "Now, Big Mama, you've been saying the Lord are good. It's the Lord is good because the Lord is singular, and you keep using it as plural." She said, "Baby, what does plural mean?" She said, "Plural means more than one." And she said, "Well, when I think about how good God has been to me, He's been gooder to me than more than just one, so I keep saying the Lord are good." Actually, Israel thought that there was more than one God, and they evolved into seeing that the God they had was a God enough, He just had different facets. So they developed different titles for God and different names for God to speak to whatever need that they had. And I want to suggest to you that it may be the same with you, that in this time of challenge, you think you need more than this or more than that. It may be that you've not acknowledged how much God you really have. The writer of Psalm 91 helps us to see how much God we have. And as Israel's theology has evolved, I discovered that what I learned at the feet of my grandparents and on my parents' knee and in church Sunday school was polished by when I went to school. They helped me to see how much God I really had. Maybe as we walk through this lesson today, we can see that you and I have a place to shelter in. Listen to the psalmist. The first name that the psalmist gives to our God is the term Elyon, he who dwells in the secret place of the Most High. Elyon literally is the name given for God because God was superior in position. He was the Most High God, that he was superior. Now, that's what they taught me at the seminary, but look like I hear, not at Baylor, but at Brazos Bottom telling me that God was so high that you can't go over him. They understood that God was above all, and you and I need to understand that God is above this. Whatever it is we're going through, that God is above it. He is watching over us. He is superior in his position. But it just doesn't mean that God is exalted. It means that God has ultimate authority. He's going to get the last word. And some of us need to understand what the psalmist is saying to us is that God is a place for us to dwell. I like that, dwelling. It's a place to stay, not a place to go, but a place to stay. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High, that because God is exalted, God has a high place to take you out and above all of this, that he's able to keep you protected above this. And God just blows me away because God keeps on inviting you and I into a permanent relationship when he knows how temporary we can be. He knows how fickle we can be. And God says, even though you are fickle like you are, I want an eternal relationship with you, that I want to give you a place to stay the night. I want to give you a place to hide out, a place that when you come to me, I'm able to keep you so that you don't have to go anywhere else. That if you've been looking for a place, we've got the Most High God. And God being exalted really does matter. I came across two stories when I was preparing for this lesson. One was the story a father was telling about his son, Cameron. He said his son, Cameron, his 9-year-old son, was bragging to one of the girls in the neighborhood about how he could dunk. He said as Cameron was bragging about dunking, the girl said, "You can't dunk." He said, "I can dunk like Michael Jordan." She said, "Let me see you." Cameron backed up and backed up. He said he backed up until he got in front of the front door and said, "Daddy, come help me." When he came outside, he said, "Now, Daddy, pick me up." When his father picked him up, he was able to dunk. Well, what it suggests to us is that there is no goal so high that you and I have a father who's able to lift us up and take us to places we can't go by ourselves. He's Elyon, the Most High. But one writer tells the story of a 12-pound Shih Tzu dog, and she said as a mother was walking the dog, some big dogs started barking at her dog. And when they were barking at the dog, her dog got afraid until a mother picked up her dog, and in the safety of the mother's arms, that dog got so emboldened, he started barking back at the big dogs. You and I know that because our God, Elyon, is Most High, when he picks us up, we don't have to be afraid. As a matter of fact, we are encouraged, we are emboldened to face any obstacles because we rest in the arms of the Most High. We live in a world that's so lacking for leadership at the highest levels. And many of us have become frustrated, some of us even discouraged because it looks like leaders just don't get it. I need to tell you that we rest in a higher authority, that the control of our lives has never rested in the White House. When I was born, Lyndon Johnson was the president. Because of Vietnam, he decided he wasn't going to continue, and Richard Nixon became the president. After Nixon dealt with Watergate, he was forced to resign, and Gerald Ford came in. And to get the country back on track, he forgave Nixon, and that cost him the election, and Jimmy Carter won. Because of the Iran crisis and the economy was so bad, Carter lost to Reagan. Reagan served his 2 terms. He was followed by Bush. After Bush only served one term. He was followed by Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton served his 2 terms, was followed by son Bush, who served his 2 terms, followed by Barack Obama, who served his 2 terms, and now the present president. In all those times, with all those different presidents, all those different vice presidents, we've only had one God. Because Elion sits on the throne. He's God all by himself, and he will be God from now on. And the good news is that they don't have to pass us around. If our hope was in the president, it would have to be passed around from person to person and party to party. But since our hope is in Elion, we can hide and rest in Elion. He says, he who dwells. As a matter of fact, that idea is sits enthroned. That because we belong to the King, we are royal. We sit enthroned under the Almighty. But then it says he's not just Elion. But then it says that he who sits in the secret place shall hide under the shadow of the Almighty. Elion is the Most High, who is superior in his position. But this term here, Almighty, is the term Shaddai. And it's an interesting term because Shaddai doesn't just speak to God being able to subdue any power, but it says that he is sufficient in his provision. Because Shaddai calls him the God of the mountains, the God who not only is able to handle any power, it's his power to create, but it's also his power to subdue. And because Elion is above all, that means he controls everything, but Shaddai will share what Elion controls it. I think Big Mama would say it like this, that God got power, wonder-working power, but also she would say to us about Shaddai that if you need it, God's got it. He is the God who is able to subdue any power, that because God has power, there is nothing. And you and I need to understand, because we're tempted to believe that we are hopeless and helpless. Now, you decide if you don't have any hope, but God decides if you can get some help. And I'm here to tell you, he's able to help you. He's got the power to fix it. And what God does not take us out of, he's got the power to keep us while we are in it. We are more than conquerors through Christ Jesus, who loves us, for we abide under the shadow. Here is a shout right here, because the text says that God keeps us under the shadow. I was talking to Phil Miller, who leads the Great Commission team for Texas Baptist, and we were discussing the idea. Phil was saying to me that sometimes what we think is darkness is really the shade from the wing of God watching over us. It's the shadow, and you don't have to be afraid of the shadow if it's God watching over you. Understand, in the text, we're dealing with some people who lived in a desert place, and the sun would beat down upon them. And as the sun is beating down upon them, it could do them detriment, but there is the shade of this eagle's wing, the protection. And God said, you've been afraid because you're in the dark. You need to understand that you're not in darkness, that you are under the shadow of the Almighty. There's light above you, but I'm there to protect you. And God is able to keep you. Yes, yes, yes. Shaddai, who provides for us, gives us courage in this time, gives us peace in this time, gives us comfort in this time, gives us provision in this time. God is able, but then I need to tell you, he's got power. As a matter of fact, down where I'm from, when they got real happy, they say he got power. It just looked like power was stronger than power. He's got the power to pick you up when you fall, and power to save your soul if you're lost, power to give you joy if you're sad, power to bring peace into your home, power to still you when you want to be frantic, power to open doors even at times like this, power to keep your mind in perfect peace, power to watch over your children while you're separated, power to dry your tears when you want to throw in the towel. God's got power, wonder-working power, delivering power. We ought to know today that he's a place to shelter in. He is Elion, the Most High. He is Shaddai, who is superior in his position. But then listen to what the psalmist says. He's the hope that holds me, the stronghold whole. I will say to the Lord, and if you read that, it's capitalized. And the term is Yahweh. It's the covenant name. We also use the term Jehovah. And just like Elion is, superior in his position, and just like Adonai can subdue any power and really is sufficient in provision, that Yahweh is sure in his promises. This idea is the self-existent one. I told you I need a little bit of Bala and a little bit of Braz's bottom. Bala would say he's Yahweh, but Braz's bottom would say he's God all by himself. He don't need no help. That God exists because he has chosen to exist. That's a shout right there. That he's the God who keeps covenants. He's the God who answers prayers, and his promises are yea and amen. That the reason God is because God chose to be. Nobody has to give God permission. God doesn't have to clear it with anybody. He's sovereign. He exists because he chooses to. He does what he wants to do. And you and I need to understand that God's promises are not contingent upon anybody else saying it's okay. That God has made a covenant with his people. He has a promise with those of us who will answer him, those of us who will follow him. He is the promise-keeping God. As a matter of fact, I have issues, and you and I, if we're honest with ourselves, sometimes we can't keep promises. The reason we can't keep promises is because of circumstances beyond our control. But we have a God who's so amazing that the Bible tells us Jesus had promised his disciples he was going to meet them. In Matthew 26, verse 32, he says, I'm going to meet you on a mountain. And chapter 27, he died. And for you and I, that would have ended the promise. But in chapter 28, he still shows up. And if Jesus doesn't let his own death stop him from keeping a promise, what happens in your life that's going to make him not keep a promise? Somebody should have shouted right at your house, preach Delvin, Atchison, that he's the God who answers even in the face of his own death. He died on a Friday, but he kept his promise like he said. And what are you dealing with even now that's bigger than a dead Jesus? If it's not bigger than a dead Jesus, I dare you to trust Yahweh with it, the self-sufficient one, the God who is because he is. One writer said about God, a French theologian said that creation was the day that God gave up being everything so man could become something. A God who loves us so much that he gives up being everything. He doesn't really need us. I know in that poem, James Weldon Johnson, the poem The Creation, said God said he was lonely. But God was enough God to keep company with himself. As a matter of fact, when he talks about himself in plural. He's so much God, he exists because he chooses to. He said, let us. And God gave up everything so we could become something. As a matter of fact, G. Campbell Morgan says about God that if God said it, it's not a promise, it's a fact. You can take it to the bank. I find it interesting that all the technology that we have, 20 years ago, this wouldn't have been possible for me to be preaching to you in your home. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have known anything about you giving online. I'm a gadget person, and you know, I like to keep up with the latest phones, and right now I only have the iPhone 10. Patrick has the 11, but I'm not sensitive. I'm talk to Matthew about helping me. But I bet that Apple probably has a 12 already ready. And what's interesting is because they keep discovering new stuff to make the product better, they keep coming out with new updates and eventually upgrades. That because they know something now they didn't know when they had the 6 or the 5 or even the 1 or even the 10, they came out with 11. When they find some new stuff, they'll come out with a 12 because they can keep either updating it or upgrading it. Since God spoke in creation, nobody has been able to come up with a God 2.0. I don't watch TV on the same television that my grandfather used. I don't drive the same kind of car my daddy drove because they keep coming up with new stuff, but I still serve the same God. The same God that saved Grandpap saved me. The same God that touched Papa House's life touched mine. Because he is God, he was perfect in his creation. There is no God 2.0 because Yahweh has been and always will be the God that he is. I'm shouting in my own spirit right now. If I didn't want to run you out your living room, I would just break out into a holler right now, because it means that I don't have to come up with a new God, that the same God who saved Arthur Atchison Sr. and Arthur Atchison Jr., who spoke into my life, will be able to speak into Devonna's life and her children's children. He is God from everlasting to everlasting. He's the same God. His truth endureth forever. His mercy is everlasting. Truth goes to all generations. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God, and you change not. You are Yahweh. Well, we need a place to shelter in. It is interesting to me that in verse 1, the psalmist talks about God. In verse 2, the psalmist talks to God. And maybe that's a word for somebody that if you've been talking about him, that really you ought to talk to him. Because when you talk to him, you'll know more about him. So when you talk about him, you'll know what you're talking about. Preach, Delvin, Atchison. Listen to this final one. He says that this God we serve is Elion. He's superior in his position. That the God we serve is Shaddai. He is able to subdue any power, and he's sufficient in his provision. That the God we serve is Yahweh, that he is sure in his promises. But he says, I will say to my God, in you do I put my trust. The last term is this term Elohim. Elohim means that he is a sovereign who is personal. Listen to what the psalmist says. He says he is my God. I like that. He's my God. He's a sovereign who is personal to us. He is Israel's personal God. From everlasting to everlasting, he's God. Now he's writing to some people whose concept of gods are gods who were foreign, gods who would bother people. Even the Greek mind who would hear this would see the gods on Mount Olympus mocking humans. But the psalmist says that I have a personal relationship with God. This term Elohim is used over 2,700 times in our Bible. As a matter of fact, it's the first time we see God. It's when we said, in the beginning, God. It is Elohim who stands in the unpeopled pavilion of his own existence on the morning of creation and takes counsel with himself and says to himself, let there be. And I would contend that when God said, let there be, in the words of the old preacher, my sanctified imagination just sees that everything with possibility stood at attention. That light looked at water, and water said, I bet I go first. And when God said, let there be light, light winked at water and tiptoed through the attic of eternity and lit up everything in its path. That's the God I'm talking about. The God who pushed up mountains, the God who flung the stars into the sky to stand as silent sentinels. That's the God I'm talking about. The God Elohim who owns the whole world. Here it is, the shout in this text, that when I talk about God being Elion, that God is infinitely high, but when I talk about him being Elohim, he is intimately nigh. That the same God who's in charge of all of that lives inside of me and you. That's the God that our forebears talked about. He walks with us and talks with us, and he tells us that we are his own. He is my God, and I would not leave this session today without having a relationship with him. God is right there with you. He wants to live inside of you through his Holy Spirit, that if you would invite his son Jesus Christ into a relationship, God comes and lives inside of us. I'm glad to know Elohim. He is my God. That means that in the midnight hour when I am upset, in the midnight hour when I am wrestling, in the midnight hour when I am insecure, when I can't tell mama or daddy or wife or son or daughter or husband, I can and talk to the Lord all about it. He is my God. He's always got time to listen to what I have to say, that what affects me affects him. He's my God. He is personal. Well, I need to bid you good morning, because I know when you leave, you're going to say, now, Pastor, I don't have time to remember all that God can be. Let me just tell you, it's amazing to me that the longer I'm around God, the more about him I discover. Israel, when you read the Bible, they had so many names for God that whatever God would do in order to celebrate that aspect of God, they would give him a new title. You remember when Abraham was called to sacrifice Isaac and got his hands up, and the Bible says behind him there was a ram, that he called that place Jehovah Ireh, Jehovah Jireh, God our provider. Moses was fighting against the Amalekites, and when his arms was up, he won. He named that place Jehovah Nissi, Jehovah Nissi. The Lord is the banner under which we fight. David knew him as the shepherd, Jehovah Rohi. He's the healer, Jehovah Rapha. And it talks about the Lord being our righteousness. And the Bible keeps giving names about what God would do and when he would be, that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the lawgiver under his feet until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Told you, growing up, they had so many names for God. They talked about him being Ezekiel's wheel in the middle of the wheel. They said he's my leaning post. He's a midnight company keeper. But there are sometimes I need to tell you that I can't remember all the Hebrew names. I can't remember him being the fairest among 10,000. I can't remember all that. So God made it easy for us. When I can't remember those names, when I can't call out those names, when my Hebrew escapes me and my Greek fails me, when I can't remember what Big Mama called it, here is the reality. God fixed it for. God gave him a name that is above every name. There is a name. I love to hear, I love to sing its worth. It sounds like music in my ear. It is the sweetest name on earth. It tells me of a Savior's love who died to set me free. It tells me of his precious blood, the sinner's perfect plea. When I can't think of those names, I can remember this name. I call him Jesus. And at that name, Jesus, every knee must bow. Jesus. At that name, every tongue must confess. Jesus. At that name, demons start to tremble. Jesus. At that name, God looks over the balcony of eternity and say, you're talking about my boy. Jesus. At that name, deaf men say, I hear what you're saying. Jesus. At that name, the blind sees. I dare you to call that name. When you're troubled, call that name. When you're frightened, call that name. As a matter of fact, you ought to just run through your house, in the kitchen, Jesus, in the living room, Jesus, in the bedroom, Jesus, on the front lawn, Jesus, in the morning, Jesus, at noonday, Jesus, at midnight, Jesus. I love the name Jesus. And one of these days, when this life is over, I'm going to stand at a chilly Jordan and with my last breath say, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. He's a place to shelter in.